Hello and welcome to Dig It. I'm Peter Brown and hosting the show with me today is Chris Day. Hi Chris.
Hi Peter.
The trend for terrarium gardening grows each year, with more people than ever creating miniature greenhouses to enjoy at home. Terrariums are simple to make, easy to care for and rewarding to have. In this episode of Dig It, we chat to Manos Kanellos, who takes us through the history, the practicalities of planting and the types of plants to grow in our own displays. We're delighted to welcome back to Dig It Manos, our go-to expert, who today is discussing the fascinating world of terrariums. Welcome Manos, it's great to have you back on the show.
Thank you. Good to be here and to talk to you and your listeners.
Excellent. So, terrariums. I suppose where do we start? I suppose the usual thing is for a sort of dictionary definition. What is a terrarium?
Exactly. It's not as straightforward as you think. I describe terrariums as mini indoor gardens with no drainage.
Okay.
And that refers to mini garden, as in it's a collection of plants. You need to have a think about how to put it together, what plants to put together, etc., etc. And there's no drainage, as in you normally use a container, most likely glass, but it doesn't have to be glass. Mm-hmm. If it's, for example, an open terrarium, you could have a nice large pot with no drainage, and you could plant some plants in it, and that, for all purposes, could be classified as a terrarium. Normally, it's glass containers, mm-hmm. And there's different types. There's closed ones, where normally with a cork lid, that they're kind of almost self-sustained systems. There are open ones, again, when they have a very big open area. And you could also argue there are semi-open ones, when you have a nice container with just a small hole. Success with terrariums, in my view, rests on getting three factors right. Getting the combination of container, plant in the container, and location of the container right. And if you get this together with appropriate watering, you've done 95% of the job.
Mm-hmm. Stepping back a bit, Manos, do you know when sort of terrariums were first sort of introduced? Were they
terrariums? It's not terrariums. It's terrariums.
Terrariums. Sorry, my apologies.
No, that's all right. And plural. The correct plural is terraria. Terra is the Latin for earth. Terrariums, it's more easy, and that's what most people use. But terraria is, as they say, more correct. Basically, they were invented back in 1829 from, or rather, a prototype in a way. They were invented by Dr. Nathaniel Bagshot Ward in 1829, where he had some bottles in his garden, and a little fern grew in one of the containers, and he thought, what that would be a good way perhaps to transport plants, and that was the main use initially. Woodian cases, you wouldn't grow plants in it, but there were large glass containers that were used to transport plants from other countries, and that revolutionized the transport, because a lot of transport due to the sea air and the long travel, they would die. But the use of Woodian cases improved that survival rate during transport.
So they were sort of more like a protective. They were a bit like a protective case, but equally, because there's a sort of term that I've come across called bottle gardening, which I guess is even earlier. That's what you're saying the first ones were. So that's
cool. Essentially closed terrariums, you could argue, bottle gardens are closed terrariums. So that was that's another way if it's the shape of a bottle. But nowadays you have such a wide variety of glass And yes, they were fashionable back in the 70s, and then they have become really fashionable in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, Manos, I was going to say, in the 1970s, it was green bottles, but you also got was it carboys, which they used for, was it for wine making?
Carboys, yeah.
But they had such a small top or lid. Again, with a bit of clever jiggery pokery, you could get plants into those and grow plants in them as well.
There have been around. There's still some nice green bottles around from, I guess it's probably from the 1970s. Yeah. But today we have such a wide variety of glass, normally clear. Green is good as long as you use plants that you can see via the glass. But you could use anything. You could use glass containers that you have at home, from coffee containers or any type of glass, really. Can be used either big or small. There's no limit to your imagination is the only limit. As they say, what can you use to make a terrarium?
And you're talking earlier about the 3 sort of crucial parts to the terrarium, and one being the collection of plants. How do you go about sort of deciding which plants make a good choice for the terrarium?
The most fundamental question, I guess, the first question to ask yourself is where I want to place it.
Okay.
So if you want to place a terrarium, for example, on a windowsill or somewhere where it gets quite a bit of bright sunlight, then you need to take this into account. Closed terrariums, for example, can receive no bright sunlight because the direct sun would make them into an oven, and everything will be dead within hours. So this is where this interaction between location, glass, and plants comes into play. If you're gonna have a completely closed terrarium, you can only use foliage plants, and it can receive no direct sunlight whatsoever. If you have a semi-open, it depends how open it is. You could potentially use cacti, but foliage plants are much less riskier. If you have a completely open terrarium, you could use any plants, cacti or foliage plants, and it can take as much sunlight as the plants you're using. So if you're using foliage plants, again, maybe an hour of direct sunlight, no more than that. If you have cacti, they can receive a few hours of direct sunlight, especially if it's a completely open terrarium. So if you get this right, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that your first concern should be the welfare of the plant rather than what you like. And if you get that right, if you were to make, I don't know, a closed terrarium with cacti, it's not going to survive for long because they don't like the high humidity a closed terrarium has.
Yes.
But if you like ferns, they're much easier to keep in a closed terrarium than anything else.
Okay, so think about the position first, and then think sort of what will grow there normally, and equally what likes it a bit more humid is probably a good starting point, is it? Exactly what you should be thinking before you buy a plant. Rather than, I like this plant, I'm going to take it and it's going to look nice in my kitchen. You have to think, okay, I like this plant. What does this plant need? What does this plant like? And if you get this into account and buy the right plant, then success is almost guaranteed.
Yeah, that's interesting because I've got an open terrarium at home, Manos, and I've got a Calathea, which I really struggle. I live in a Victorian cottage, and light levels are quite poor in some of the rooms. However, in the terrarium, it positively thrives. It's quite close to a window, but I think it's because of the extra humidity within there, or even though it's enclosed. But I think it's just getting the right plants for the right place, really, isn't it? You were mentioning about the ingredients to a good terrarium. Obviously, compost and soil. How crucial are they?
Yes. Although it is possible to make a terrarium without a drainage layer, the essential bit is to have a drainage layer, which is basically half an inch or better an inch of gravel, grit, clay pebbles are ideal because they change color when they're wet. Any large gravel, anything that will not rot in water, and so that will give you a lot of leeway with watering.
Right.
So you create a drainage layer at the bottom of the container, I'll say half an inch, maybe better an inch. Then you sprinkle some activated carbon, which is basically worked charcoal, well oxygenated, so it can. And the reason for that carbon is to minimize the risk of any odors or toxins. The activated carbon normally sold for terrariums is like medical grade. Is the stuff they give to people when they get poisoning because it absorbs toxins.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately, it doesn't work with alcohol. Otherwise, you can just drink as much as you like, eat a bit of activated carbon, and then there you go. There's all the toxins out of your system. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So you put a little bit, like a teaspoonful or two, depending on the size of the container, and then you add the soil, which if you're going to use cacti, you can use cacti soil. If you use foliage plants, you can use a specific terrarium mix, or you could use, say, Houseplant Focus repotting mix. Peat-free mixes are fine. And again, you need about an inch of soil, if not a little bit more. And if you want to mix a little bit of charcoal in the compost, that's fine. It's not necessary, but it will be a good thing. And then you just add the plants. And again, it's good when you talk about plants. A couple of things to say is good to use the same groups of plants. So if you want to make a cacti terrarium, use just cacti or maybe some slow-growing succulents as well. Cacti and succulents can work, but succulents grow much faster than cacti, so you need to take this into account. Or you just use foliage plants. If you're going to use a closed one, you could use ferns, or you could use Fittonias for color, etc. But the bad thing would be to mix cacti with foliage plants, because the foliage plants will grow much faster and will cover over the cacti, and they also need different watering, different conditions. So you need to ideally keep to one group of the plants. And how to arrange, you could, it's what you like really, but my advice is to go for the general gardening technique of creating layers for added interest. So you add, depending on how you're going to see the terrarium, you add maybe a plant at the, for height at the bottom, and then something in front of it to bulk it up, and then some sort of low-growing plant or something for color. It's good to have a theme, like to go for green or variegated plants, or to go for just color. But this is where people's like come into play, and it's really whatever you, however you like to put them together.
And just thinking, sort of when you're planting up, do you need sort of special tools, or I mean, what would you use if? Because I guess access is going to be a bit harder.
Your best tools are your hands.
Okay.
But if you're going to use foliage plants, I don't think you need anything apart from maybe a very big spoon to handle the coir and the materials. If you do the compost and the materials, if you don't want to handle them with your hands, that's fine. Special tools come into play. Maybe you need some barbecue tongs if you're going to use cacti. But if you special tools comes if you're going to use one of these old-fashioned big bottles with a very small opening where you need to insert the plant very, very carefully. So it is worth thinking before you buy the container, how are you going to make it? Because some containers I see around sold for terrariums are really, really, really difficult to make it in terrariums. They can take you hours and hours. And also you can't use a wide range of plants because of size. Mm. So it's worth thinking about it. Most containers I see around, as long as you can put your hand in it, that's the best tool you can use.
Yes. Okay. once you've planted them, Manos, do you water the plants in? What would be the process of settling those new plants in their new bottle garden or terrarium?
Once you plant, depending on how wet the soil you've used is, it would be good to give a little bit of watering, but not too much. That is the most common thing. People confuse love with watering. I love my new garden, I'm going to give it a lot of watering. My advice is to give very little watering very, very slowly. So using a very large spoon to just water around the plants, give them a couple of tablespoons of water, and then go the next day, see how it has settled, maybe give it a little bit more, rather than watering it with I don't know, a pint of glass. We would just go straight through. You want the water to dissipate in the compost, and the best way for that is to either use a stream, a mister with a stream, or a small watering can with a rose. So the essential thing is for the water to dissipate into the medium rather than to go straight down. And longer term, they will need less watering than you think. The best way for watering a terrarium is to use the color of the soil. Dry soil looks much more lighter in color than, say, wet soil. So as long as you water a little bit around the plants to start with, and you keep observing the color of the soil and the clay pebbles if you use them at the bottom, then that will be your best guide for watering. Closed terrariums, for example, will need very, very little watering because the water recirculates in the container. I've got a closed terrarium. It's fine for about 3 months now. Not a single drop of water. It doesn't need it. I keep checking. I check every other week. I feel it in my hands whether it's been a bit low or anything. But because, as I said, the water recirculates within, it doesn't need any watering. Some cacti terrariums, again, they will need very, very little watering, like cacti. Some others, if it depends where it is. If it receives a little bit of light and the plants inside are kind of fast growing, then it will need a little bit more watering. But again, every 3 weeks, 4 weeks, as a regular interval, and the equivalent of, again, depending on the container, but the equivalent of a cup of tea of water, that kind of quantity at the very maximum. If you water a little bit, you can always go next day, check, and give it a little bit more. But if you give it a lot, there's no way for it to come out.
And interesting, you pointing out, obviously, Manos, that we're not watering quite as often. Are we feeding, if you're only, say, watering the terrarium once a month, would you recommend sort of a little bit of houseplant food once a month with that, or would you say even less?
Most composts will have a bit of feed in. So you need to look at the packaging, and normally you wouldn't need any feeding for the first 4 to 6 months,
yep.
or mostly in the winter. In the summer, it would be good to give it a bit of feed, say with every other watering, a bit of appropriate good quality feed like Houseplant Focus or Cactus Focus, because they're not as fast growing. Again, they don't need too much feed, but a little bit of feed with every other watering would suffice.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah. And Manos, sometimes in terrariums people like to create a bit of a landscape. They might use sort of props, maybe stones or pieces of slate or moss.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very, very fond of that. It's good to have a theme. I like very much the interplay between stones and plants. Sometimes I use cork. I use vertical stones mostly. When I go with my kids in the beach, I just keep looking around and I find some really nice, interesting stones to use for when I do workshops to give to people. But then again, I find some really nice stones, and I just don't want to give them away. So I create more and more terrariums so that I can use these beautiful stones. It's good to use things that mean something to you. You know, it could be a little ornament, a little Buddha, or a little bit of I don't know, a little gnome or a little fairy. You could make a nice fairy garden with sort of a collection of plants all around, and the fairy right in the middle. You could. There's so many things you could do with a terrarium. You could use a technique so that you don't see the soil if you are experienced with watering. You could use then colorful substrates. But as I said, you could make your own little world in the terrarium, and that is I think where that's their value. Whereas just having one or two plants in a pot, that's the one thing. But to create a little bit of a garden, then that is I think much more interesting. And I keep calling it a garden because, like a garden, it does need managing. So you need to pinch the plants from time to time to make them a little bit more bushier, depending on the plant. When you make it, you try not to make it completely full. So you could see it growing and then filling all the corners, etc. And like everything in life, a terrarium has got a lifespan. So from foliage plants, you should get a couple of growing seasons, and then the plants would have outgrown the container, probably. In which case, not the end of the world. Take them out, put them in a pot, and wash the container. Make another terrarium. If it is cacti, they'll keep the same look for years. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. I have a terrarium here in front of me with the cacti and succulents, and it looks exactly the same as when I made it back 2 years ago.
Gosh, yes.
So that's another way to consider. If you want something to last for a lot of time, cacti and succulents are better than foliage plants.
I did make a mistake a few years ago. I planted up my open terrarium with some mind your own business plants, Helxine. It was the variegated silver one, which I always thought was unknowingly not as fast growing as the green. I was very wrong. It literally took over the terrarium within sort of 3 months, completely swamped all the plants, and it looked very spectacular, but no space for anything else. So you learn from your mistakes. And on that basis, Manos, is there any plants you would definitely avoid?
That's funny, because that's exactly what I like. I saw a terrarium exactly like that. As you say, maybe the other plants had died, I don't know, but the mind your own business had completely taken over, and it started growing all the way up the sides of the bottle. And I loved that so much that I made a terrarium. I'm looking at it right now, which is just a nice cylinder bottle. It's not actually, but just a nice glass cylinder. And I only put in some mind your own business. And right in the middle, I put a flat stone, and on top of it a little Buddha. And to me, then I wait for this to start growing on the sides of the cylinder, and I think that would look spectacular. So it goes to say what some people find not as good, some other people find exactly what they want. This is where personal preferences come into play, and where you talk about taste, there's nothing you can argue about. Really, it's whatever you like.
I think you're so right there, Manos. I saw one recently which I thought would appeal to children out there, which was a terrarium planted up, like you say, like a little garden, and they'd used Lego people. And it was like, how cool is that? It's like a little Lego car and chaff. It was like brilliant. But yeah, I think that's the joy of creating them, isn't it? Is that if you want to do a sort of deserty type theme, you can do a cactus one, or a tropical one. Then things like the mind your own business and those sorts of plants can really do that. It's great.
Manos, do you have any particular favourite plants? I mean, you mentioned quite a lot already, but do you have any, your go-to favourite plants which you'd say you try to include?
I like Fittonias very much because they come in so many different colors and they're so versatile. They could be used in closed terrariums, in open ones, and I say they come in so many different colors: pink, white, different shades of red. So that's my go-to plant. And also I like having color in the various terrariums. So I would say that this is. I mean, I like all plants, but I'd say this is probably my favorite one.
For sure. And flowering plants in terrariums. I mean, I know many years ago, I think there used to be little Saintpaulias African violets were sold, and we don't see them these days, but they always seem to work very well. Is there any other flowering plants you would sort of suggest, or would you avoid?
Kalanchoes are good. Flowering plants will tend to do better in open terrariums. Mm-hmm. The reason being that the high humidity in the closed terrarium will create possibly mold on the flowers. But for open terrariums, I've seen a lot of Kalanchoes being used. But also sometimes cacti, because of the higher temperature that they can get into the glass container, they can also tend to flower as well. So yeah, flowering plants, they could be used. Not a problem. There's not as many. There's not as big of a variety. So an alternative to flowering plants to create some more interest is either to use Fittonias for color or to use variegated plants like Peperomias, Begonias, that sort of thing.
And we're talking about watering and getting the right location. When things go wrong in terrariums, what's the usual sort of reasons? Is there one or two you can think of which?
The most common reason that things go wrong is overwatering. It's basically, as I said, people confuse love with watering, and once you water it too much, there's just no way to get the water out. Pests, they would get possibly in closed terrariums. You wouldn't get any pests. In fact, sometimes people put in some insects to create added interest. But in all open ones, they can get mealybugs or like normal house plants, but nothing special. Like most house plants, if you put some thought when you're making it, as in what is the you can get that combination of location, plants, and container right, then I say guarantee success is 90% guaranteed.
Mm-hmm. Well, one pest which I thought I'd mention, because we do seem to be getting a lot more cases of it at the garden centre here, are fungus gnats, scarrid flies, and we think they're coming on because of the fact we're using peat-free compost now. They seem to be living in a lot of the organic material. Now, if you got a problem of scarrid fly in your terrarium, what would be your suggestions of controlling them?
You are very right. Fungus gnats are much more they're much more common with peat-free compost mixes, because a lot of the peat-free compost mixes use composted bark.
Yeah.
And especially this summer, because being very wet, the flies have laid eggs in it, and then the composted bark is used in the repotting mixes, and then when they get quite warm in the house, they come out. It's a problem we'll probably have to live with in trying to live in a more environmentally friendly way. Most of them, fungus gnats are a nuisance, but they don't harm the plants, and in most cases they will just fly away. In closed terrariums, if you get them, then you'd need to open it for them to escape. Otherwise, being quite moist, they may lay eggs back into the compost. Because in most terrariums, you would use a layer of decorative grit to show off the plants, then they can't go back and lay eggs. So that would be beneficial. But if you do get them, you could either spray around with SB Invigorator, or if you just you could use yellow sticky traps. That would be another way to get rid of them. But they would normally just come out and fly away. And with the decorative grit, sometimes they wouldn't even be able to get out of the compost and die in there.
Yeah, the decorative grit certainly does help, and that's one of the suggestions I certainly give to customers to grit over. And obviously, if people have had their houseplants out during the summer, obviously we're into the winter now, but to be careful to give the plants a bit of a spray or watch out for them in the early weeks of bringing them back indoors. So yeah,
that's it.
Yeah.
And Manos, any good places to look for resources, or sort of any good books that you can think of that you'd recommend for people?
Garden centres will be the best place to go for these things, especially plants, because you could maybe see sometimes you see plants sold in I don't know, in Tesco or whatever, but these are not good places because they don't keep them very well. When they have them, they're not the place. They're not accommodating to plants. The people who supposed to look after them don't know how to look after them. So garden centres are your best bet for good quality materials and plants overall.
Okay.
And obviously, you are an orchid expert, Manos. So would you ever put any of your orchids into one of your bottle gardens?
The problem is drainage.
Mm-hmm.
That orchids need very good drainage, but terrariums can't provide it.
Okay.
There are some of the only orchid I would use in a terrarium is Ludisia, which is called, or otherwise known as the jewel orchid, which is mostly appreciated for its leaves rather than its flowers, and because it's normally grown in soil rather than in bark, you could get away with very careful watering in a very coarse specialist orchid mix. It could do well in a terrarium. Any other orchid, I think, would be it's very, very tricky because of they would appreciate the high humidity, but at the same time there's no drainage.
Okay, that's interesting. And also, man, obviously, whilst we're chatting to you, we're obviously into the winter period now with our indoor orchids. Any sort of little bit of advice for our Digit listeners with what they should be doing at the moment?
They will appreciate if you are growing cymbidiums. You should have brought them out. You should have brought them in 2 days ago. I live in London, so in this part of the world, we had a very low temperatures a couple of nights ago. So that will be the time to bring them in the house. I have mine in the house. I'm just looking at them now, and they just started flowering. They started flowering outside, but as soon as you bring them in, you see a much speedier. What's another flower bud? Oh, 5 flower buds. I'm happy. I just noticed a new flower bud on my cymbidium. Excellent. It made my day, really. So if you grow cymbidiums, it's time to bring them in. If you're growing other orchids, you need to start thinking about giving them less water as the light levels drop down. When talking about light, is now the time again to consider, are they getting good light where they are? In a month's time or so, you could maybe move them very close to the windowsill or even on the windowsill to give them more light going through the winter. So if you grow cymbidiums, bring them in. Other orchids, start lowering the amount, increasing the frequency, or rather lowering the frequency that you give them water, and make sure they're receiving adequate light as we go into the dark winter months.
And what about feeding? Are we going to be less likely to give them any feeding?
My advice is to to feed them with every other watering. And as you are lowering the frequency of watering, then naturally they will receive less feed, which is what they need. They don't need as much feed in the winter as they do in the summer.
One of the things we've noticed recently, Manos, is the supply chain of orchids seems to have sort of fallen down a little bit. Do you know sort of what the reason for this is?
Yeah, yes. Brexit.
As simple as that, yeah.
There you go. Basically, because some of the orchids are also present in the wild, growers having to import them into this country, they have to fill in some paperwork to say that these are not wild orchids, because this is to prevent people getting orchids from the wild and selling them on.
Is this the CITES?
It can go, yes. So the growers need to do more paperwork to sell them in this country.
Right.
So they don't bother because they can sell them without all this paperwork in other countries, in the rest of the European Union. And the other thing that has happened is because of so there is also not as many growers now as there used to be 2 or 3 years ago before they were in Ukraine, because of the increased energy costs, they stopped growing. They stopped growing, or they sold the contract of gas, etc. So there are less growers, and when you ask them to do more work to sell a product at effectively the same price, then I say they go elsewhere. So it's very difficult to get brassias and cambrias into this country. So the most common orchids now are dendrobiums, cymbidiums, and phalaenopsis.
And even those have been quite difficult to source over the last few months. And it's been certainly noticeable even during the summer, when usually there's plenty. There's almost a glut of them coming across from across the water there. But hopefully it will improve over time. Manos, we introduced a little part of the show after when we chatted to you back in 2021. And we like to ask all our guests that you're shipwrecked on a desert island. Which plant or tool would you wish for so you could enjoy your life on that virtual island?
My mobile phone. That would be one thing. But if we're talking about the plant, you see, you're talking about desert island. So I'm somewhere in the tropics, right?
Yep.
So I would take a plant, you see, this is where my thinking about what plants need rather than what I like. I would want with me a nice palm. It's a Maedora palm. That would be a nice one. Okay, I may have other palms around me, but I know this will do well and will stay with me for years and years. Or there is another lovely plant I like. It's called, I don't know if I can remember its Latin name, but it's called elephant's foot.
Okay.
That is also a plant that I think would do very well in the desert island I have in mind, which is just a very small island with a nice big farm and a few coconuts dropping by from time to time. So there you go. Having a plant that would do well in that environment would make me happy, because it's going to last for me for many years, compared to having, I don't know, something else that wouldn't easily do as well.
That's it. And it'll give you some nice shade as well, so you'll be able to enjoy your siestas in the shade. And Manos, you kindly come out and do lots of talks around the country to lots of different garden centres, so I'm sure you've met lots of different audiences. Have you got any funny stories from those events, or any tales you'd like to share with us which will give us a little laugh?
When I was writing my orchid book, I passed the house of a neighbor, and he had a couple of orchids on his south-facing windowsill, which were really, really bad. They had a couple of flowers, really nice, but the plant itself was not in a good state, because of the direct sunlight damage. And I thought, so good examples of what not to do. So I thought I need to knock on her door and ask her to borrow them for a photography, to take some pictures and then put them in the book. But then I thought, and a sort of middle-aged guy knock on somebody's door in the, I need some help here. What to do? I said, okay. How about using my kids? I do so many stuff for them, wipe the bums and pay all this money for the food and whatever. Why can they not be useful to me as well? Excellent. So I took my son, which was back then 5 years old, as my charming assistant. So we knocked on that door and we said to her basically, hello, my name is Manos, I'm writing an orchid book. This is my son, by the way. Your orchids are so, I was about to say bad, but I didn't. I said, so interesting that I would really like to put them into my orchid book. Can I borrow them, etc., etc. And yeah, she laughed it off. Where I didn't. Then we got friendly and explained that they were kind of bad and what she was doing wrong, etc. But then since then we became friends because it turns out she had a daughter the same age as my son, and they go to school now. And I said we become friends, and it's been really good. So yeah, that was
excellent.
That's a nice story.
Stayed in my mind.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a lovely story. And did you manage to fix the orchids? Has she now got them out of the direct sunlight and in a better place?
One of them was beyond repair, but the other one, yes, it just changed the location, and suddenly it was a much better. It became much better.
That's good to hear.
Stuff.
Manos, we've already organised for next year, 2024, an orchid date at the Garden Centre, the 20th of March, which we're really looking forward to. But I believe you've got a new book out, which you're more than welcome to mention and plug on Dig It.
Yes, I've written a book called Terrariums, A Beginner's Guide, which is basically a very nice handy guide as to how to make your terrariums with what plants to use, how to make it, and 3 or 4 techniques. And I'm quite proud of these techniques because a couple of them, they may exist, I don't know, but I've thought of them myself. Is about how to, for example, making it correctly, but only seeing the soil, not seeing the drainage, or making it completely the other way around. If you're experienced with watering, you don't see any of the soil, and you can see different patterns of decorative sand, etc. And how to interplay with plants and stones, etc. How to make terrariums with air plants, with carnivorous plants, etc. So it's quite interesting. It sells well. It's available from all the good garden centres. So yeah, I'm quite happy with it.
That sounds great. Sounds perfect for Christmas.
Yeah, I'm busy working on the second edition of the orchid book. I have just submitted the final text to 2 gardens, so hopefully it will be on sale at the Orchid Festival, at the 2 Gardens Orchid Festival in February.
Lovely. Oh, excellent. Oh, you're keeping very busy, Manos, which is so good to hear. That's good. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Manos.
Thanks,
That's
Manos.
been really interesting, and terrariums was a subject that I hadn't really researched much on myself, and it's a fascinating way of gardening, isn't it? It's really interesting.
Yeah. Go on, make your own. Make one yourself.
I think I'll do it.
But I warn you, they are addictive. You'll make 1 or 2, and then you say, I want to. That's what a lovely stone. I want to use it so I'm going to use it to make terrarium and so on. They're quite addictive, but very good fun.
Thank you. Yeah, sounds very good. Thank you, Manos, once again.
Thank you very much. Good to talk to you.
Today's show was brought to you by Buckingham Garden Centre and Nurseries. The show was hosted by Chris Day and Peter Brown. The show was produced by Peter Brown. And our thanks to Chiltern Music Therapy for providing the music. Thanks for listening.
At Chiltern Music Therapy, we want everyone to know the difference that music can make in their lives. From parents and their premature babies in hospital to grandparents with dementia. We provide music therapy and community music services to people of all ages and needs across England. We work both digitally and in person in people's homes, care homes, schools, hospitals and hospices. Find out more at chilternmusictherapy.co.uk.